All right, I want to welcome all of you. Some are still joining us. We'll continue to admit them as they come in. We want to go ahead and get started so we can make the most use of the time we have together. Really want to, again, welcome you. I can't think of a program topic for our adult education program this afternoon that could be any more timely than this one. In case unless you've been living on the moon, you've probably been doing what we've all been doing, which is very carefully following the election and the results and the tension and anxiety and excitement around that. And we're delighted to have this program today to look at that and to welcome Mike McCurry to talk with us. And I think talk with us is mainly what we want to do. Mike is going to make some remarks here in a few moments, but he really wants to talk with you. And we have set this up as a Zoom meeting as opposed to a webinar so that you can all see each other and Mike can see you, and that you will later have an opportunity, those of you who want to ask questions directly of him. We've got everyone muted right now, but after Mike makes some initial remarks, we will give you the ability after that to unmute yourself. Now we ask you to still continue to stay muted unless you've been called on to ask a question or share a comment. But you will have the ability to unmute yourself and talk with Mike and talk together on this. I know everybody has a lot of thoughts and feelings and questions, and we really look forward to hearing from you. Just to remind you, we will have a program follow-up on this again next Saturday at this time. At that time, again, Mike will be our guest, and we'll be looking then more, not today is more about the election and the results and the implications and our thoughts and feelings about that. Next week, we'll look at some issues, and particularly some issues that people of faith need to be looking at and thinking of, and the role that Christians and other people of faith can play in these next few years. So we look forward to the second program then again next week with Mike McCurry. Want to just say a word about Mike and then turn this over to him and let him make some opening remarks, and then we'll start going into some questions. Let me just say, if you do have questions, you see the chat function down at the bottom. Go ahead and click on the chat function if you have a question, and either write in briefly your question, or maybe you just say, I have a question. That's fine. I just need to know who to call on, just to flag it so we see who would like to pitch in. So be thinking what you'd like to talk with Mike about, and as he concludes, you can go into chat and say you'd like to share a question during that period. So Mike McCurry is the director of the Center for Public Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and he's also a consultant, communication consultant with the firm Public Strategies Washington, Inc. Most of us, particularly those of a certain age, remember Mike and his smiling face, not always smiling, but often smiling face, during his days from 1994 to 1998 when he was press secretary to President Clinton. Mike has a long history in politics, in the communication area. He worked as press secretary for a couple of United States senators. He worked on 3 different presidential campaigns as a press secretary communications director for John Glenn, Bruce Babbitt, Bob Kerrey, and then finally he found a winning candidate and got to work in the White House with President Clinton in 1994 to 98. After he's in the White House, he went back to school and studied, among other things, at Wesley Theological Seminary, and that's how he came to his position at Wesley. And he's been there now for, I think, almost 10 years. And just delighted, Mike, to have you with us today. Look forward to your comments and then to talking with you. So Mike McCurry, welcome.
Well, great, Theo. It's great to be with you. Can I suggest maybe that we just start with a moment of prayer, if that's okay with everybody? Creator God, we've been through such a wild experience in your creation, and I can only imagine that you look with amusement at how we deal with all the various things that we handle here in your creation. But we know that you're with us and that nothing that we do will violate the way in which you keep your love for us, and that if our love for you is constant, that we can make it through whatever difficult times and challenges that we have. That is our prayer. That is our prayer in the name of the great rabble-rouser that you sent to us in the person of Jesus Christ. So let us be together as we have this conversation together, which we look forward to very much. All this we pray. Amen. I don't know where to begin. It's like, when we scheduled this, who knew that today would be the day that it would look like it's over, but it's not over. We have a now declared president-elect of the United States of America and a new vice president declared elect. And what we face in the next couple of weeks is going to be challenges, litigation, court appearances, demands for recounts. So it ain't over until it's really over. And, I'm increasingly believing it doesn't get over until the Electoral College meets in December. And that could present its own confusion because of the ways in which that may get a confused result, depending on what happens in that environment. But our joint Congress is supposed to meet, early in December to ratify and the results that have been certified by all the states that are now, concluding their counting of the results. They now have secretaries of state in each of the states that have to certify those results, send them to Congress. Congress has to then consider them. And we don't really elect the president until Congress meets in joint session to consider the results of the Electoral College as they're presented. So there's a lot of opportunity for mischief in the weeks ahead and the days ahead. And Lord knows we've got, we have a president who's capable of a lot of mischief. And so I don't think we're necessarily through this. We have a lot of people dancing in the streets today because they think the result has been conclusively resolved, but maybe not. And in the way in which we do litigation and our processes, we may still be in for some controversy, and we may be in for some further discussion about what the results really mean. And I think it's pretty clear based on the president's tweets in the last couple of hours that he's going to contest the result and not accept, what has been presented by our major media networks and others as a projection that Joe Biden has been elected president. So it's a troubling time for our nation. And I think there are a couple of things, just to kind of level set where we are. First, an extraordinary number of people voted. I mean, we'll get the final percentage on turnout, but it is very clear we had the largest turnout of voters in American history. Now, part of that is demographic. We just had more people voting, but more people participated. And I think at the end of the day, when we look at the percentages, we may have a historically high percentage of those eligible voters who participated in this election. And I think anyone would have to, regardless of your political flavor, you'd have to say that that's probably a good thing. We want more people participating in our democracy. We don't mandate participation as they do in some countries like Australia and elsewhere that you have to vote. It's a voluntary exercise, but we had a lot of people who went out of their way to participate in this election and to have their voice heard. And I think, that fundamentally has to be respected at some level, regardless of what you think the outcome is or how you think they express their vote. The other thing is completely obvious too, is we are a very polarized nation. We are divided, no matter how you look at all the numbers that are flowing across the TV screen right now, it's basically a 50-50 country. And there are a lot of people who just cannot accept the liberal socialist Democrats. And there are a lot of people who cannot accept, the version of Trumpism that they think has been so damaging to the country over the last 4 years. And that polarization, I fear, will continue to persist, that there's going to continue to be this kind of division within our political culture. There are going to be people who just are not willing to listen carefully to what the other side has to say. So we have a real challenge in what we talk about in what we call the public square. I think tonight's session is that we are going to really focus in on the election. I'd like to hear what many people here on the call feel about the results. I think a lot of you probably would like to vent a little bit, or you'd like to express your own opinions. And I think that might be the most useful way to spend some of our time. And then next Saturday, I think we ought to talk about, well, what do we do about it? What's the role of the church? How does the church make a difference? Is there a role for the church? What is the role that religion and politics plays in a country that venerates the constitutional idea that there's a separation of church and state, which I think is an important principle, but it's one that ought to be understood a little more carefully. And a couple of observations about the election results based on what we know so far from what we've heard from exit polls and what people went to the polls and said. There was, widespread belief that there was a huge gender gap between men and women. And that does not appear to have been as pronounced as many people had predicted when they first started looking at, what the predictions were for the elections. And I think that's kind of an interesting question. Do men and women have different views of politics and the future of the country, and how do they express them? What do you see in your own life? What do you see in your own relationships with anyone that you love and that you spend time with? Have you had difficult conversations about some of these subjects? I think that's kind of an interesting subject. The second is that there was kind of a widespread belief that the changing demographics of America would be such an important ingredient in this election. And primarily that is, we had, so many more Hispanic voters who are now eligible to participate, and that they would make a big difference, and that they would largely, be more inclined to be pro-democratic. Well, it turns out that many Latino voters, particularly in places like Florida, Arizona, some of our southwestern states, inclined to be, much more ecumenical in their political views. And many of them, in fact, voted for Donald Trump over some of the others. So I think that was, a pretty interesting outcome. And then the last observation I'd make, and then we can open it up for some conversation. It is, we are ending up with, again, a very divided Congress. We will probably, is still unlikely until we know what the outcome is of special elections in Georgia, who will be the majority leader in the United States Senate, but it could very well likely be Mitch McConnell, who won re-election against a very capable candidate, Amy McGrath. And he's been pretty formidable in the way in which he stands up to presidents and directs the legislative agenda of the United States Congress. And so even if Joe Biden becomes our president and inaugurated January 20th, which now we fully expect to have happen, he's going to face a Congress that is going to be very difficult to work with and to actually achieve any true legislative accomplishments. Now, that may not be the worst thing in the world, because I think there are a lot of changes that will happen once we change an administration from Republican to Democratic. We end up changing a lot of people who are in very important positions in our government. And probably that's the first and foremost thing that President Biden is going to have to do, which is to really figure out how do we get people in places that can make a real difference. So one of the key things critically and early he has to do is to deal with the pandemic that has had such an influence on this election year and on our politics. But he's got some very capable people who will do that. I predict that Ron Klain, a friend of mine, who did great work for President Obama as head of the Ebola task force, could very well emerge as being the head of that effort, maybe even as White House chief of staff. And he's a very capable guy. So, what gives me some optimism is I think there are a lot of very good, qualified people are going to start emerging as leaders in the new administration that's about to take place. But there's has got to be some healing and some reckoning and some time for people to absorb what's just happened. And it literally is just as of today that we have a definitive result that we can begin to process and begin to work with. So, I'm interested in, we got a lot of people on the call, and I can imagine a lot of you just want to talk through this. I know in my own family, I've been on the phone with my relatives and friends all day long. I've got a little bit about my history. I'm from South Carolina, and my family is from Northwest South Carolina. So all my relatives and friends down there, they've been like, they're only crazy about two things, which is Lindsey Graham and then the Clemson Notre Dame game tonight. That's the main thing that they care about. But I think people are, say when they know my background and they see me when I'm down there for a visit. I was down there last week for my birthday and visiting with my mom and a lot of the people in her church who are friends of mine. They all kind of like, their first question is, well, what's going on? What's really happening? Because they don't trust information sources that they use. They don't know if they're getting the right story. Many of them buy into the idea that it's all fake news and it's all been manipulated by the media, which I think is a very, very unhealthy way to think about how we formulate some basis on which we make decisions in what we call the public square. And I think that is a useful place for us to all be engaged. I think that, I'd love to have a conversation now about how all of you are feeling about the election results and what you think it all means. And then I think next Saturday, we should turn our attention to what can we do about it? What is the role that you play as individual citizens? And then what role should the church play? I will say, I've been involved in a lot of different kind of efforts in the time since I left the White House. As Theo said, I've been, engaged in a different line of pursuit. I teach at a theological seminary. I work a lot in the area we call public theology, which is the way in which faith and politics interact. And I have to say, those are very troubled waters right now, because I think people are not really sure what is the role that the church should play in our public discussions. And we venerate the subject of separation of church and state, but at the same time, throughout American history, people of faith have been fundamentally important in guiding where the country goes. And so how do people of faith respond to some of the current issues that we face, and what could be, in fact, a very important constitutional historic moment as we look ahead to the next several weeks and months. I'm trying to be a little optimistic here, because I think there are good people of faith who can make a difference and could help us go in the right direction. but we also face some dark impulses in our society and in our political culture. And I think we have to name that, and we have to be aware of that. And to those of us who believe that we've got to require better angels among us to respond, we have to summons them to be amongst us and to be part of how we deal collectively with this moment in our history. So those are some opening thoughts. But I had hoped mostly that I could hear from a lot of you and what you all are thinking, how you're all responding, because I can imagine many of you who are Zooming here have probably got your own thoughts. So let me throw it open, and you can ask questions. You can ask me about anything on your mind. You can ask me about Monica Lewinsky, Hillary Clinton, any of the other women in my life. My wife is in the background over here, just frowning at me. But I'd love to hear what you all are thinking, and let's have some dialogue.
Thank you, Mike. And I invite you to put a comment in chat, or if you want to say something, just say in chat you'd like to be called on, and I'll call on you, or you can say what you want to talk about, either one. There's one comment there I want to ask about in a second, but if you would just say, while we're waiting for some other comments and people to identify, you warned us about mischief ahead here over the next few weeks. I think we have some idea of that. Most people that I've seen expect none of this to succeed. You said you think it seems very likely, of course, that Biden will be sworn in, but maybe just a little more about the mischief and what we need to be on the lookout for. Certainly there'll be court cases. Are there other particular things of concern over the next few weeks as some of the deniers on the Trump side begin to continue to resist this?
Well, my main concern is that it's with the question of the mail-in ballots, which was something that was encouraged as a response to the pandemic. The people who were fearful about going into a polling place had the option of doing a mail-in ballot, so they mailed in their ballot. And now a lot of that has been, denigrated by comments that President Trump has made, because he says, these are all stolen votes, or, they're trying to steal the election away from me. So he's trying to alter what was in fact set up as a way into which we could respond to a public health issue by giving people options to vote. But he's now turning that into a way to kind of challenge the legitimacy of the election, and to call, frankly, as a result of this speech he gave last night, really call into question the structure of American democracy. So maybe that's a little bit beyond mischief. It's really in some ways heartbreaking that we've got that tonal quality in our politics right now. And I look, for a session like this, I do not want to be too partisan. I think everybody knows, I'm been involved in Democratic politics for 35 years now, and have been a part of, Democratic campaigns and Democratic administrations. So I don't want to, pretend that I'm anything other than a loyal Democrat, but I'm also very concerned about how we, at the end of the day, bring ourselves together. And I thought, if you watched the speeches that Biden and Trump gave yesterday, the contrast was, remarkable, because you had, I think, a very angry president who believes something is being taken away from him. And you had Joe Biden trying to be, kind of conciliatory and bringing people together. In some ways, I think both of the presentations were a little bit inadequate for the moment that we need right now. But, I do think that at the end, people will begin to sort out, well, what do I really care about as an American? And what do I really want to hear? And what do I want our leaders to do to try to reach for some common good? And even if I disagree with people who sit in the pew with me at church, I know at the end of the day, they're good people, and that we can hopefully come to some place where we resolve differences and we begin to work together on the issues that matter. Next Saturday, I'd like to spend some time about how do you really do that? because I think that's a hard thing to do. And I'll talk more about that next week. But I do think we all have to kind of devote ourselves to doing something to reinvigorate our democracy and to come to some better solutions.
Thanks. Let's hear from some other folks. There are a couple of comments about, I think I'll even call her Vice President-elect Harris. I think we can do that at this point. In the role she might play in this, Janine McKay noting how potentially important that is. And then Martha Davis had a question. Martha, do you want to state your question, that you had about Kamala Harris? We unmute Martha and hear her. You there, Martha? Can you unmute yourself?
I was searching for it. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I wasn't expecting that. My question was whether or how we could use Kamala Harris. It's so nice to have somebody other than a white man on the top scene. So how could we use her as a fresher face, as a springboard towards racial healing, or just more positivity and optimism?
Well, you know, the role of the vice president in American history has been a complicated one. I think it was John Nance Gardner who once said, the vice presidency is nothing but a pitcher of warm spit. I think he had a different word, but that was how he described the role. But it began to change. It began to change in part with Walter Mondale, who began to develop a real partnership and a real role. I saw it develop, you know, very clearly with Al Gore when he was vice president. And then I think Joe Biden, you know, helped redefine the role of the vice presidency. And she has such a unique role because she's now, you know, at the highest level of the US government, emblematic of the demographic change that's happening in our country, because she's young, she's, you know, of a different racial background of what we've traditionally seen. And obviously, you know, she's a woman. And I think that opens up a lot of opportunities for people to become more engaged. You know, if you would ask me what's the one major thing that has to happen in our democracy, it's that older white guys like me need to get out of the way. And we need to begin to reflect the diversity that is the America that we live in now, because we are much more diverse, demographically, racially, gender-wise, transgender-wise. I mean, we've just got so many more variables in our political equation, and she reflects all of that. And I think she could be an important voice. Now, the delicate thing for a vice president, having worked in the West Wing and knowing this, is you can never upstage the boss. So she has got to define her role in a way in which, you know, the president is still the person who's leading the country. And she cannot be subservient. I mean, that would be the wrong role, but she has to kind of play that role in exactly the right way. And I think she's fully capable of doing that. She is a very smart politician. She has got a lot. She's taken her hard arrows in her time in California as Attorney General, so she knows what it's like to be under fire from time to time. But I think she will emerge as a very important voice to kind of express what the new America looks like, and that'll be a added value plus for Joe Biden. But she has to kind of like figure out how are you in the shadows even when the spotlight wants to shine on you. And that's a difficult place to be, but seems to me very capable of doing something like that.
Will she be the last person in the room? I think that's going to be a critical question, because that's what Joe told her he wanted her to be.
Yeah.
And so I just raised that as an issue.
I It's a very, very good point. I mean, what you want in a vice president is when you've had in the West Wing all of the advisors in, and they've all argued their points back and forth, and you are trying to wrestle with a difficult decision. By the way, the president doesn't get things across the president's desk that are easy to decide. They're always hard. They're always hard, and they're always different and conflicting points of view. And you want to hear everybody. I mean, I've been in many meetings like that in the Oval Office, and you want to hear what everyone has to say, and then you want to reflect on it, and you want to have someone who is there to kind of say, you know, what are you thinking? And here's what I think. And I think from everything I've seen, I don't, you know, I haven't been part of the campaign enough to know the real relationship there, but she seems to be able to have that kind of relationship. And she seems to be the kind of person who I think Biden would trust and turn to, because she is thoughtful and intellectual. And I think Biden probably appreciates that she has her own political ambitions for years ahead, because she's going to be around for a long time. And Biden respects that and knows that she will be there. But I think he will probably incorporate her in a very important way in some of the decision making. And knowing some of I know a lot of the Biden folks in the high command of the Biden operation, and all of them have told me they have enormous respect for the way she's handled a lot of the things in the campaign. She's been easier to deal with than some of them thought she would be. Some of them thought she would be a little difficult to deal with, but they've, like, across the board, say she has been a real trooper. And I think that probably increases her value not only to Biden, but more importantly to the people who will be the senior staff at the White House that will incorporate her into decision making. So I see her playing a very significant role in the new administration.
We have a question from John Quinn about how divided we are as a country and how to think about that. John, you want to unmute yourself and ask that question of Mike directly? Everybody, the unmuting is in the lower left corner there if you haven't found it on your computer.
Am I unmuted?
You are there, John. We can hear you.
Okay. Mike, as I indicated in the chat box, the concern is that you and so much of the rest of the media that we pay attention to you said we're divided on a roughly 50-50 basis. The concern that I expressed is that, at least in terms of presidential voting, that's mathematically incorrect. Both Hillary and Biden have already achieved more than 50% presidential votes. But on so many other issues like healthcare and gun control, even taxes, there is a lot more unity than 50% with respect to those issues. And my concern is that if we claim to be 50-50%, that gives us an excuse, if you will, for not trying to be more effective with respect to those issues that are very significant to a much larger percent than half of us. All of us are yearning for unity, but unity is too elusive, as it 50-50 just sounds too risky to flip a coin. And I don't think we are there, and we all certainly think we shouldn't be there.
So Mike, are there some areas of agreement that are much broader than 50-50 that might be a basis for moving forward? I think is what John is raising.
Well, I mean, look, John makes a good point, but you have to confront the reality that we did not end up with an overwhelming vote on one side or the other. I think many people like me hope that, Biden would win in a blowout and there wouldn't be any question and there, wouldn't be any challenge to that. We didn't end up there. We ended up, frankly, in a place where it's going to be very, very difficult to get legislation through the Congress. And John, because it is going to be 50-50. I mean, at best in the US Senate, it's going to be 50-50. Maybe not. Republicans may still have control of that chamber of our US Congress. And the capacity to sort of develop a vision and inspiration and getting people to move forward around a more united vision that moves us beyond the polarization that we have is really the quintessential question of presidential communication and the use of the bully pulpit. And I think that's going to be Joe Biden's challenge. If he can summons the nation to some vision of what we can achieve together and what we can do together if we move beyond this split. Now, you could say, well, it's not 50-50, it's 52-48. Well, it's still like a very divided country. But if he could find a vernacular and a vocabulary that begins to bring people together and saying, okay, well, maybe I can go with that. I can go with something different. I could set aside some of these differences in order to make some progress on issues I care about, then maybe progress is going to be capable. I wake up some mornings and I'm very pessimistic. I wake up some mornings, I'm maybe a little more optimistic about how we're going to deal with all of this. But, at the end of the day, I think I have to be realistic. And the realist in me says we are, with a Congress that's going to be, very, very divided with, very slim margins for Democrats in the House and, maybe no Democratic margin in the Senate, which means that there's going to be a possibility that anything that we would try to advance as responses to the critical issues we face, whether it's global climate change, immigration, income inequality, poverty, hunger, the status of children in America. I mean, all the things that I think are important to me as a citizen. Are we going to have any political environment where we make progress on those issues? And I think it's going to require a different kind of politics and a different kind of political communication. And whether or not we're capable of that is still a question that will hang in the balance. But John, I just have to disagree with you. I mean, we are a deeply divided country and we are divided 50-50. I mean, I have to say I'm personally disappointed that 48% of this country still thought that Donald Trump was capable of being reelected as president. To me, that's heartbreaking. And, that's just revealing my own political preference, but it's also some sense of how I feel. And how do we understand why people feel like that? And how do we understand how many people like that wanted to vote for Donald Trump at the end of the day, despite everything that, you could put a whole litany of things out there. You would sort of say this guy disqualified himself in the last 4 years for some of the things he's done. But, a good half of our fellow citizens did not believe that and still voted for him. And I think we have to be honest and confront that and try to figure out, well, what was that about? Why did that happen? And how do we reach out better to create something that is more of a common good and reach those people who've got those points of view, because we know them. I mean, if you don't know them, that's part of the problem, because you don't talk to them, you don't know them, and they're not part of your life. So I mean, in my life, I've got relatives and friends and neighbors, particularly in South Carolina, who are Trumpsters, and I know where they're coming from, and I know what I know part of it is that they resent liberal intellectual elitism. They think you all look down your nose at us, and you think you're too smart for, you think we're dumb, and you think you're so smart, and you think you know better for what the country wants, and they resent that. It's in the French political discussion, it's called ressentiment, that they resent the way in which we look at them. And until we on the center left confront that reality, we're going to be stuck at 50-50, to dispute John.
There are 4 or 5 others who've indicated they have questions. So let's see if we can hear from several. I think Fred and Melanie Dan have a question. One of you, Fred?
This dovetails with John's question a little bit, or your answer. And I'm wondering what intellectually or spiritually honest grounds for breaking bread with the people who support Trump. I think back to after the Civil War, there was an agreement on the lost cause that both sides fought nobly for on both sides of the war, and that if you weren't white, by extension, especially African American, you got thrown under the bus. So my question is, how do you accommodate or break bread, even if they want to break bread with you, in a way that doesn't throw progressives and non-white people under the bus? Thanks.
It's a great question. I don't want to preempt, because that's actually what I would like to spend more time really thinking through and developing strategies for when we talk next Saturday. But my answer to your question is, we have to first hear what the other is saying. And a strategy that I think is very conducive to that is when you sit and break bread. And first of all, it starts with, I reach out and I actually want to hear and listen to what other people have to say. And then it's the ability to kind of repeat in an honest way what you hear them saying. Like when you sit down and say, okay, what I think you're saying, here's what you're saying that you're unhappy with about the direction of the country, or here's what you're advocating for the future of the country. And you state that in an authentic way. And then the person who might otherwise, they might be opposed to your point of view, or someone that you don't necessarily, have anything in common with, at least they would say, okay, well, he heard me. He heard what I was saying. And so then there's at least some commonality, that there's a respect that you understand I have my opinion, and you've heard me, and you might disagree with me, but at least you respect me for having that opinion. And I think that requires some training. By the way, when we talk next week, I mean, that this is the work that I'm doing now at Wesley Theological Seminary. How do we train seminarians to go out and work in the church and guide those kinds of genuine, authentic conversations? Because I think it's vital. And I'll tell you, it's not easy. It's easy to sort of say, oh yeah, we're going to all kind of sit around and do kumbaya together. But when it comes down to it, when you get into the reality, it becomes a much more difficult thing to do.
Ms. M. Johnson had a question. You want to unmute yourself and
Yeah, hi Theo. Hi Theo, this is Molly.
Oh, I was.
Hey, the question that I had is relative to kind of the immediate aftermath, and as Mike put it, the, I guess, hijinks, shenanigans that we can expect. Mike, I appreciate your time dealing with the media and probably your careful attention to words that are being used and shared. And one major concern that I have is, what do we need to be listening for? What do we need to be paying attention to relative to words that may incite violence and this kind of continual assault to our democratic institutions? And maybe what can we do about that? I find the ultimate irony is to refer to this presidency, the current presidency, as a law and order president, when I feel like some of his rhetoric has done everything to just incite violence. So,
Well, I want to think about that, and thinking about, we're going to, I keep pointing to the conversation we will have next Saturday, only because I'm punting the question because I haven't really figured it out yet. But I think part of it is to make people who feel like they have been snobbed by liberal intellectual elites feel like that they've actually been heard, and that even if we disagree, we don't disrespect them. Because I think the root cause of a lot of the dysfunction, and frankly, the root cause of a lot of the Trump vote, are people who feel like you all don't really respect who we are. And you thumb your nose at us. And we just, we want you to hear what we are really about. And I think the answer to the question is that you've got to go to the heart of really building relationships that will make a difference with people. And that, look, I plead guilty. Aside from my own redneck cousins down in South Carolina, I don't have any real friends who are big Trumpsters, because that's just not who I socialize with. It's not who I see and who I chat with. And, of course, because of the pandemic, it's not like we're hanging out with each other and socializing that much anymore. But, think about your own lives. How often do you really sit down and have a genuine conversation with someone who is a real Trump supporter and just disagrees with where you are? And because we tend to try to overwhelm them with facts. Okay, well, here's factual information that you need to know, and that's not what they want to hear. They want to hear that you understand who I am and what I'm about. And that's a pastoral responsibility. This is what we will get into, I think, in our further conversations, that this is what's the role the church can play in something like that. And I think I blew your question because you had.
Well, I guess I was wondering, do you think we should anticipate, what Joe Biden was referring to as the kind of the dog whistle to the alt-right? Do you think we can anticipate more of that in coming weeks?
Yeah, I think Trump is just going to go down as hard as possible as he can. And there's a lot of reporting today, some of you, if you follow the Washington Post reporting today and elsewhere, even his own staff has an inability to prepare him for the reality of what's to come. And I think they are probably fearful of what his own reaction is going to be. And, God forbid that we ever have a president who incites violence, but he is going to, it's going to be, it's going to not be a dog whistle. It's going to be, someone said, a dog blowhorn. He's going to really put it all out there, and it's going to happen. It's going to probably start happening today, if not tomorrow, because of the call in the presidential election. And he's not going to go quietly into the gentle night. And so I think strategies of how you deal with that and how you kind of suppress that and how you prepare for that. I mean, I was downtown Washington for a doctor's appointment yesterday, and the entire downtown Washington, D.C. area is boarded up with plywood.
Boarded up.
And they, you know, because they sort of think bad things are going to happen. And
Yeah. Yeah. Mike,
Let me ask. Janine, we've lost your sound here. I think.
I'm sorry. Well, I just have to jump in now because I know the AME Church Metropolitan. I go to their Bible study and they are very worried about violence against them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people are talking about getting guns.
Yeah.
So we, you know, we just don't, we're going to. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You've got a little bit of a background noise, Janine, that we're hearing when you talk too. But no, it's a real concern. Appreciate you sharing that from Metropolitan AME. We have just a few minutes and a couple of others who've wanted to ask a question. Beth Braxton, do you have a question you wanted to ask?
Okay, yes. Mike is a theologian at the seminary. I was wondering if you might speak to our religious right friends. Can you hear me?
yes,
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. Our religious right friends, and not just the evangelical, but I've been associated with a Catholic group and have been very interested in some incredibly negative stuff that came from a couple of Catholic priests about voting for Biden. And it was just, it really concerned me. And I thought, you know, I feel like we need to, as Protestant liberals, we need to widen our circle to the Catholics and evangelical and somehow get together and talk about it on the basis of our faith, of what Jesus taught us, you know, love one another, you know, some of the basics. So.
Can I ask what Catholic group? It's not Network by any chance, is it?
No, it's a small support group of Catholic women who don't want to leave the church, but they're very, very concerned about it. Some are at Our Lady Queen of Peace in Arlington, which is known
Yes,
for its.
yeah. For those of you following this, I do a lot of work with Sister Simone Campbell at a group called Network. And that has been kind of a progressive element within the Catholic advocacy community that's done extraordinary good work. And
Joan Chittister also has been an author, and Richard Rohr, an author out in New Mexico, but all who just give a incredibly good theological spectrum of things. And I just wonder if can't we, in a sense, join together and bring in and dialogue with some of our evangelical Christians, some of your South, yes, your Baptist, Southern Baptist.
Good. Thank you. And go ahead, Mike. And do mute yourself again, Beth. I think we're getting a background noise. Yeah.
But you know, it requires genuine and authentic dialogue. And you know, the point that I was making earlier is it requires really hearing them so that they believe that they've been heard, because they've got, you know, for me, it's hard to accept a lot of what they argue and what they say. But at the same time, that's where they are, and we've got to take that into account. And the fact that we have not taken into account is how we end up with, you know, almost half the country voting for Donald Trump. Which is where we are. Theo, I wanted to mention to everyone on the call, if you don't get your Washington Post Sunday edition early, the Sunday Washington Post tomorrow has an excellent article that I think everyone should read, that you would appreciate because it's right on the topic. It's by the editor of the Washington Post magazine, Richard Just, and it's called God Save America, and it's right on this topic. right on where do religion and politics intersect. So it'll be, if your morning coffee gets cold, it's a great read for tomorrow if you haven't already gotten your Washington Post, if you subscribe. Otherwise, I'd go on the website and try to get a hold of the article, because it's right on this point, and it's right on the question of what strategies do we develop to try to deal with this, and what do we do if there's an incitement to violence, if there's a call to arms that comes from the White House. I mean, it's astonishing me to think that I would actually have to raise that as a possibility. But, they're barricading the White House. They're putting up sandbags around, the West Wing, because I think people really do believe that we are going to go into some period of maybe even direct civil violence. And just how we hope and pray that that does not happen is something I think we in the faith community really have to think hard about.
There are two or three other questions that actually are things that point to next week, I think. And so we're pretty much out of time. So I think we'll try to close here. But there's a question about how to deal with conservative religious leaders like Franklin Graham, who stand up and say they speak for Christians, and other voices. And there's some other questions about how we use our churches as places for dialogue and listening. And is there a way to do that? And again, I think these are the kind of things we may want to pick up on next week. It's very much to talk about there, and again, what our role might be. So, thank you, Mike, for your time. I don't know if you just have a final word you want to say.
On that last point, thinking of Franklin Graham, I got through a friend of mine who is active in a group called Focus on the Family, which is a very conservative religious.
Is this from Tim or?
From Gogline, right?
Yeah.
Correct. I know you must know him. So he invited me to go down to Liberty University, which I did, and was on a panel with him and two other faculty members. And we had the most marvelous discussion with a group of, very conservative evangelical students who were, much more open-minded than I had anticipated being. I thought I was going to have to put my camouflage on and go in combat mode. But we had a reasonable conversation. And if you could do it in a place like Liberty University, now Franklin Graham Jr. did not show up for it, by the way, I'll point out, but if you can find places like that where you kind of engage the other and find new ways of having these conversations, I think we end up in a better place. And I think I'd propose that would be what we talk about next Saturday, that we talk about strategies of how you do that, both at a practical level. How do you do that at your church? How do you do that, in our own lives that we lead? And what do we need to change in our own behaviors that actually to make that happen? Because I know that's something I reflect on myself. It's too easy to just sit in the bubble and watch CNN all day long. We really have to kind of break out of that and really think about how do we begin to encounter the other. So anyhow, a great session tonight, and I'm so glad you are doing this. If you talk about adult education, we all need to be educated. So.
Thank you, Mike, so much. And no, this sets the stage well for next week. I hope everybody who's on will join us next week, and probably some others also, because that is a vitally important conversation we want to have.
And I would encourage, if people have got, we didn't get to all the questions you may have had tonight, but if you want to email me, I think you've got my email address, right? So
yes.
Feel free to circulate that. And if anybody wants to send some questions in advance, and so I can kind of work through those a little more efficiently than I did tonight, I'm happy to do that.
And if any come to me, I'll kind of gather them up and send them to you, Mike. And maybe we can talk before next week and just kind of think through, some of the content of that people are wanting to talk about. But thank you very much, Mike.
Great.
And thanks to everybody who joined us and your questions. And let's take a deep breath, as we've been told over the last few days, and be glad for progress being made and just hope we can get through these next weeks without fracturing the unity that does exist in the country.
My last comment is I've been emailing today with a good friend of mine who's been under fire, to Father John Jenkins, who's the president of Notre Dame University, because all my family down in South Carolina, they're all Clemson fans, and the Clemson Notre Dame game is tonight. So I'm finding that if I can turn my attention to something like a college football game, that's a good diversion from some of these other things we're doing.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, we all need our diversions in this time. So thank you all. And we'll send out a separate link for next week. It'll be a different link. So watch for that. And do send any questions or comments you have to me, and we can pass those on to Mike as we prepare for next week. Thanks so much, Mike McCurry. Okay.
Bye, everybody.